All right, so I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, and then what I normally do is I start this by asking people how they or their ancestors, whoever was first, came to this country and came to Savannah. Yours is such an interesting story that you might want to start backwards by giving me some background about yourself and then saying why a project having to do with the Jewish community interested you.
Stop it. My name is Mary Ford Parion. I live in Savannah, Georgia. My dad was from Mississippi. He came to Savannah through the Army Air Corps during World War II and met my mother, who was working at Hunter at the time. And my grandfather, her father, was in the clothing business. I became interested in genealogy from having to go to cemeteries all my life. From my mother to my dad on both sides, they always took us to the cemeteries. And I was a history major from Armstrong at one time in my life and taught history. So that added to my interest in family. Okay, now what do I do?
Tell me a little bit about your interest in TreeLoft as a project.
Okay, I read about the TreeLoft project through the Jewish newspaper that I received, and I thought, gee whiz, I've been for over 20 years trying to locate members of my mother's family and never would get the correct answer. And when I discovered, I had known that her family name, one of the names was Solomon's, I knew at that time that there had to be a Jewish connection, but nobody would tell me. So in the early 90s, my mother's brother was here, and we went to Estill, South Carolina, which is where my grandfather's family came from, and there is a family of Solomons there that are related to us. And I started asking questions, and they said to us, take this road, go to this turn, take another turn, and there is a cemetery you need to see. So we did, and when we got there, it said Solomon's on it, and at the time there was a Star of David cross, or not cross, the Star of David symbol was over the fencing. So we ventured in, and I'm going to my uncle, oh my God. I said, I don't believe this. And one of the cemetery headstones was a man named Saul Solomons with his birthplace in Leipzig, Germany. Then there were, of course, other Solomons buried in that particular space, but nobody would tell me much of anything. The family in Estill said from the beginning, well, the story goes that Saul Solomons was allowed to marry a lady named Esther Elliott Graves, and her father said the only way he would let her marry him was if he would stay in the county, which is Hampton County now, and that he convert to Methodism. So the Solomons family located in Hampton County are all Methodist. And over the last few years, I went to a Jewish genealogy session at the JEA, and of course the lady there helped me a little bit, but gave me some directions to go in, and that's when I located the name Saul Solomon's father, who was named Aaron Solomons, and again coming to Charleston from Leipzig, Germany in the late 1700s. So I started over, intervals of time looking to see, okay, what else has happened here? And from Aaron, we had Saul, who married an Esther Solomons. He had several children, one which was named Henry Elliott Solomons, which is where I'm coming from, who he married an Elizabeth Williams. They had a daughter named Hetty Catherine Solomons, and she married Henry Manley Parnell, who was my grandfather's father. And they had a child who was Samuel Walter Parnell, and that is my grandfather. And my grandfather came here from Estill and married Mary Ann Wallace. And the family has been here ever since. The story I found from one of my cousins was that Saul had a brother named Hart, and he early on came to Savannah, and his side of the family stayed here, and their children grew up here. And so that's the end of the story.
Okay, several questions.
Sure.
The Hart side of the family in Savannah, are they Jewish?
Yes.
They
Yes.
are.
Yes.
So are they related to any of the families that are currently here? Did you ever explore
I
that?
have no idea. I have not been examining his side of the family at
So
all.
what year would that have been? Do you know?
That he would have come here?
Well, or what year, was his brother in Estill? So,
Okay,
so what years are we talking about?
Saul was born in 1771 and died in 1843. He married in 1822. So I gather Hart probably came to Savannah somewhere in the early 1800s.
But you don't have any information about Hart or anything else?
No.
So if somebody was interested in the Jewish lineage, they would look for the Hart
Hart.
Solomons of the early 1800s in Savannah.
Correct.
All right. Coming from Germany, immigrants often didn't come to the south. They often came
To the
to the
north.
north. Do you know anything about the port of call, or how, or what type of job he was doing that necessitated him going to South Carolina, to such a small town where
Correct.
he met your
Correct.
great-grandmother?
Particularly in that time frame. Aaron Solomon's I've located was a dry goods store owner, and Saul was a jeweler. So I located 3 places in Charleston where Aaron had a store, and he belonged to the synagogue there. I have nothing on a wife, Aaron's wife. Everywhere I've looked, I dead end. I gather he had some brothers that he left in Germany. Saul, being a jeweler, probably wanted to move inland, away from Charleston, and set up his business there, and he probably became a farmer at the same time. And that's the extent of it. The rest of the family that stayed there in Hampton County all became farmers.
Unusual occupation for Jews, because historically Jews were not allowed to own land. So I'm trying, so many people tell me that they had relatives who owned the Jew store. Jews were allowed to be merchants and
Right.
often had to travel from place to place for security reasons, and because they weren't allowed to own land, didn't have homesteads. So they gravitated towards that kind of businesses. And so you do hear about people who settled in the area. There was a glut of merchants, and then they had to move to another area where in order to facilitate the fact that they needed to earn a living.
Correct.
And so that is how a lot of people ended up in small communities without other Jewish people. It sounds like yours is more of a love story.
I'm beginning to think so. I don't understand what precipitated the move from Charleston to a rural area like Hampton County, because that was all farmland in that time frame. And being a jeweler, there was probably some need to service people there, but at the same time when he married, he probably received some land, and that probably is where the farming began.
This is kind of interesting because it kind of turns on its head some of the things that I've been talking about with other people. I have been talking about Jew store, I have been talking about living in rural areas, and then the challenge of maintaining a Jewish identity. And even though he did not maintain a Jewish identity, and his children would not maintain a Jewish identity,
Right.
the fact that he still had Jewish relatives is of relevance, because then if he had any contact with his family at all and wasn't disowned by them, then his children, which would have been your grandparents, yes, would have known of their Jewish ancestry, but that was not the case. That it was hidden from you.
Well, this is like, we're going back 4 generations. Not include, well, my grandfather, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. And it was like they all accepted the Methodist religion, and nobody ever mentioned the Jewish religion as being a part of the family. And here I come along in my 30s going, wait a minute, somebody has to put this story together for me. And even a distant cousin, he said, it wasn't ever hidden, nobody ever spoke about it.
Is your family still Methodist?
I grew up Episcopalian, and so did my mother, because her family, my mother's maternal mother was Episcopal. So, no. But another interesting feature of this is one of my mother's brothers he married 3 times, and his last wife was Jewish. And I don't have her maiden name. And then they had 2 daughters. One took the Jewish religion and one took the Episcopal religion.
From this area?
Well, of course, my uncle was from here, but he was in the Army, so he traveled. And no, he met this lady up in Indiana when he was stationed up there.
And is that where they eventually lived?
No, they eventually settled, after he got out of the Army, after 30 years in the Army, they settled in Las Vegas.
Oh, that's another story.
That's another story, yes.
My history of the area is not necessarily accurate, but I do know that Jews settled in 1733, and your opening date for your great-great-grandfather is? You said he was born 17.
He came in 1796 at the age of 25
Okay.
to Charleston.
All right. So, and the Charleston, the synagogue in Charleston is 1820. So I'm trying to think. And Methodism, I believe, started 1790. My dates could
Well,
be
I
off,
don't know.
but I'm trying to piece together. I know that there were Jews in Charleston. I don't know that there was organized synagogue in Charleston until 1820, and that was KK Beth Elohim.
Right.
And so it is possible that even though there was a Jewish community, because there were certainly people settling there,
Mhm.
I believe the William and Sarah. The ship that was coming here with the 41 Jews
The initial.
from the Vivus Marks, I believe that they were on their way to Charleston, and they ended up here because of the yellow fever epidemic, and the doctor
Mhm.
was needed to help. And that was, again, 1733. There, but the congregation in. Hold on just a second.
Sure.
I want you to tell me something about your life now, and you're obviously not Jewish, but you have a tangential relationship to the Jews of Savannah. Have you noticed anything about Jews as a population that's a stereotype that either is or isn't true?
Before I even enter that one, let me say, growing up, we had a family house on Whitaker Street on what's now the Starland District. My best friend lived across the lane from us, and she was Jewish. And we went through school together, and I would go to the synagogue with her on some different Saturdays. I felt so much at home and didn't have, I'm 7, 8 years old, and I didn't have an understanding of why. And my daughter, one of her best friends in school, my oldest daughter, was invited to a bar mitzvah of one of her friends. And she said, "Mom, I just feel at home." And I don't know what, it's just weird. It's such a connection that you don't even know that you have.
Jewish people pass on traditions in a lot of ways, and throughout history, there have been incidents of people who were forced to give up their religion. Obviously, that's not the case here, but forced to give up their religion, and in small, subtle ways imparted to their children certain family rituals that turn out to be, even if you don't remember where they come from or why, that turn out to be Jewish ritual. Do you think that there's anything that your parents did that you learned about, or maybe some type of, growing up in the South, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, there was a lot of racial bias, that maybe in your household that wasn't the truth, and that maybe some of that stemmed from the fact that they had a more diverse background?
Possibly. Before the Depression, my grandfather owned a store with several other gentlemen, and I believe they were both Jewish men. And when the Depression hit, they lost the store, and looking for work, he ended up being hired by Levy's department store. So I think there is a connection, even though he never mentioned anybody in the family being Jewish. My grandparent and my grandmother had been deceased before I was born, but my grandfather was always very open, and he treated one person just like he did another. If they were good people, he looked at everybody as being good.
So, in general, from what you know about Jewish people, and when you were growing up, where blacks and whites were segregated, did you notice that there was some segregation that was applied to your Jewish friends? Either in terms of clubs they were or were not allowed to join,
Now, you're
or
talking about the
sports?
50s, the early 50s. If you talk about elementary school, no. No, I think we were all treated equally as children. The only difference, of course, black children were not involved because of segregation, but yet where we lived, there were people who lived near us. Like I said, there was a lane that separated our streets, Whitaker Street from Barnard Street, and there were black children that lived in the neighborhood, and we played with them even back in the 50s.
Do you ever remember a time where Jewish students were out of school, public school, because of religious holidays, and how that was treated?
More so in high school. But no, I personally don't think there was any disparity between them and us. I played a trick on my mother one year in high school, and it was a Jewish holiday, and I didn't want to go to school. I said, I'm not going to school. Okay, Mom, it's a Jewish holiday. She said, you can do this time, but not again.
Did she write you a note saying you were in observance of the Jewish holiday?
I don't remember. She probably just said I wasn't feeling good that day. But I always thought that was just a good joke I had played.
You said that one of your best friends was Jewish.
Yes.
Do you remember what synagogue she attended?
At the time, it was on Drayton Street.
Drayton Street, so that would be the Agudath, and that would have been the conservative synagogue,
Okay.
Which basically means kind of band of brothers. Certainly the language would seem a little strange. Did any of the customs seem familiar? Because Episcopalian religion is also a very regimented, ritualistic religion?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, you used a prayer book, or in our case, we used a prayer book, and the Jewish people were using a book which had a set of orders to follow, which is what we do in the Episcopal Church. And I think the most intriguing was the separation between males and females. And that to me was different. But other than that, I didn't see that much of a difference. The language was different, yes.
But certain things like priestly benediction and
Correct.
Those things are...
And there was a choir which sang, and the processional coming in with the Torah. I mean, we do a processional also, so that was just the same. It was just in a different language.
There's so much strife in the world today, and so many people instead of embracing diversity, often fight it and prefer to be not only with their own kind, whatever that
True.
is, but also set up barriers so that there's a lack of cooperation or communication. What kinds of lessons do you hope that you teach or taught your own children, and hope that your own grandchildren would have to kind of combat that? What lessons have you learned growing up?
I learned to respect people's differences. I think that's a main feature in getting along with other persons. As far as my two children, well, my husband's another story, but we decided to do the Unitarian religion with them, and because they taught world religions, and we thought this would be the best way for them to see many aspects of different religions, not just one. And they also learned there's more than one, that people can get along, and that you have to respect each other, and everybody has differences of opinions, and that you don't have to believe what one person tells you as the truth. You know, you have a mind of your own, and you can sort things out for yourself.
As an outsider looking in, do you have any words of advice for the Jewish community, so that we can kind of meld a little easier than we have in the past?
I don't think it's the Jewish community. I think it's those outside of the Jewish community that need to reassess their own backgrounds and to accept people for themselves and look within instead of looking around them and creating the problems of the world. Gee. Didn't know I was going to be on the spot here.
It's beautifully said, thank you. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to say? Any story you'd like to tell, any memory you'd like to impart, or words of wisdom?
Words of wisdom. Well, mentioning my husband, he grew up as a Presbyterian. His dad was from Italy, and he was Catholic, and his dad had married early and divorced, which of course excommunicated him, and met my husband's mother, and she was Presbyterian. So his side of the family grew up Presbyterian, all his relatives grew up Catholic. He went to Georgia Tech and lost religion. So the Unitarian aspect and the intellectual aspect of their bringing made him easier to tolerate religion in general. But he was always out to argue with any priest.
Is there any precept or custom or ritual of the Jewish religion that you've observed or participated in that you think is valuable and for other people as well?
I've always been intrigued with Hanukkah. The days that are set aside for Hanukkah and the meaning behind it, and the fact that it's not the gift that the person's getting, it's the meaning behind it. And it's not how much you spend. It can be just a little tiny remembrance that you're giving someone. And I've always thought that was just so intriguing, and it just fascinated me. Even as a young kid, I was always impressed with that.
Thank you very much. This is a great interview.
I hope.